Yeah, okay. Hey, Goldie, Pat was asking me about Yoder's too. Pat, did you swing by yet?
Hang on. No. I wonder if the one in Apple Creek is the same family. Of course, everybody's a Yoder down there, but they look like they have a nice store at Apple Creek too.
Goldie, have you been to that one?
Neither one. I'm planning on hitting both of them though. Fredericksburg first, just to get my supplies.
Yeah, I just went today to buy more stuff.
They probably, when you walk in the door, they probably say, Jessica.
I know. I keep getting this one girl though, who every time messes up my order and I have to like go back and like pay the difference. Always the same girl.
Hey, Jessica, what do you get down there that's worth that drive? Because isn't it a pretty decent drive?
Everything.
Is it everything's cheaper down there?
Oh yeah.
I'm gonna go down and get Pro Mix because I can't seem to
Pro
find
Mix.
the
Yeah.
big bales of Pro Mix around here.
I'm going to show you this, although I'm slightly embarrassed by my purchases.
Hi, everybody. This is Coletta. I'm sorry I don't have video tonight, but I was going to say I found Promex out in Geauga County at the Geauga Growers. It's just a couple dollars more than what you have, Jess, but I guess that's more of a distance.
Yeah.
Where is that Geauga Growers?
Geauga Growers on 528.
Okay, thanks.
Just north of 87.
I was at Menards yesterday in Columbus, or in Lewis Center, just north of Columbus, and Menards had Pro Mix down there.
You can get the huge bulk. I forget the size. It's like $28 for like the ginormous one.
Yeah, it was a big bale.
Yeah.
So what else did you get there, Jess? Let's see your goods.
I got all of my super tunias. This is right next to Yoder's Produce. They're like $1. What was it, Goldie? $1.25 for one.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Oh my gosh.
If you go to Petiti's, they're like $6 to $8. So
That's great.
I got a lot of racks going on. Lots of
The price is going down.
Oh my goodness.
April 1st.
yeah. So I got a
So
lot
go
going
now.
on.
Is that your dining room that we just saw? It's beautiful with all the plants.
Oh yeah, with my grow racks. Yes.
It's great.
It's a little crazy, guys. But Chris, they have like vermiculite. I bought my kale and clay that Tony recommended from there. The oil, Tony, I forget the name of the oil.
Stylet oil? The JMS?
Yep. They have fertilizers, they have pots, they have trays, they have baskets, like hanging baskets, if you're into that. Drip line irrigation, if you want like a high tunnel. It's probably the cheapest place in Ohio to like put together your own high tunnel.
Huh. Interesting. I know I've gone down to, I have a friend, and either I go down or she goes down, and we get stuff from that Ohio Earth Food.
Yep, that
And
totally goes there too. Yeah.
I think their vermiculite prices and perlite prices, a lot of times they're not bad. And even if you tell them when you get there, I don't care if it's got a little hole in the bag. Sometimes they've sold me stuff for like 40% off just because it has a small tear in the top, and some people would care if it had that.
Yeah. All right. So it's 7:03. And tonight Ron is gonna lead us through the next series of modules.
So you want to walk through the introduction thing again? Yes, sir.
Is there anybody new? I feel like everybody has been here.
Good.
Ex-
Okay, before I start, you ready for me to start?
I think so.
Let's see, I want for all of you new candidate judges just to see that you are official. I have one of each of these for each of you, along with a pin when we're actually together in person, and hopefully the certificates and stuff will be in Ohio then instead of in Florida. So, assuming that I remembered all this stuff, you're now official.
Right, better.
Okay, I think I am already screen sharing, and I'm planning on just doing the partial screen, because when I go to full screen, I kind of lose control of it. So if this is a problem, wave your hand or something, and I can go to full screen. But if this is sufficient, if this turns out to be insufficient at some point, holler and we'll switch. Okay, we're going to cover six of these judging curricula tonight, and I think we'll just kind of walk through them. And I guess I would prefer, unless you're, just urgently can't wait, to try to wait to ask questions until we get to the end. So make yourself a note or two while we're going through, because we are going to cover a lot of material, and I hope that there will be plenty of discussion at the end. Okay, number one item in the list is modulate, and that's substance. And we will go through a series of slides to describe what it is and how it affects the entry, qualities and faults, and how to evaluate substance. Here's a couple examples that they include that show core substance. Can you see my arrow on the screen? Obviously, this bloom is shot in the back, and this foliage is wilting and drooping down. So substance shows up both in the bloom and in the foliage. I guess I disagree a little with this slide. They say two parts, genetic makeup of the cultivar and good growing practices. And I think the one that we ordinarily see is the third one, and that's just the age of the bloom. As soon as you cut a bloom, it's going to start to fade a little bit. And you maybe recognize substance most easily by going through the show on Sunday night before we tear down, and you can see that everything is suffering from a loss of substance. So that means that may be what they mean by good growing practices. That is maybe grooming and hauling practices, because if you don't keep your blooms good, well hydrated, as you bring them to the show, you'll lose substance pretty quickly. I want to make a comment. I hope you remember Tony and I talking about Wayne Schatz, Wayne's good friend. When he first time came to my garden, he said of a particular plant, this is how I understand good substance. And he put his hand on the top of a bloom and moved the bloom around and basically moved the whole plant. I mean, it was just solid. And I think in a way, it is a good idea for you to have in your mind what you consider to be good substance, because you can find cultivars that have tremendous substance and tend to keep it. So I certainly agree with genetics. Genetics make a big difference for substance and the retention of it. But age is another key factor.
I was just going to say, Ron.
Please, Tony. Yeah.
I was just going to say, just kind of an analogy that I like to use is that when they talk about genetic substance, you're really talking about how stiff that petal is. And that's definitely genetic, a lot like with people who have the same number of follicles on their hair, but somebody has fine hair and somebody has coarse hair, and it makes a big difference in the appearance. And with our dahlias, if you have a thick petal, it's going to hold up better, especially in our varieties that are like our cactuses that don't support each other so well. So that's kind of a way to think about genetic substance. A lot of times it's just how substantial that individual petal is.
Thanks, thanks, Tony. Yeah, I sure agree with that. It's the value of it in a score sheet is 10 points. So when we get to seedling judging, this is one of the group of 10-point characteristics, along with all of the rest of the ones we're going to talk about. Okay, next, here's there's some nice examples of blooms that look turgid, and that's probably why it's there. I'm going to talk about desired characteristics and faults in here in a second. Here are the desired ones: crispness, firmness, springiness, toughness. I don't associate much with that one, except maybe in handling. A cultivar with good substance will handle being banged around some better than ones with low substance. Maybe that's what that means. Faults you associate with soft ray florets, like that first slide that we looked at. Lack of springiness, missing, dropped, or falling ray florets. If you come up to an entry on the table that's got a lot of blooms laying around on the table, chances are it has lost substance. And the ray florets are starting to be thin and wilted and shriveled. Here's another one I disagree with. It is certainly true that if you see a lot of pollen on a single entry, it is past its peak. That is, it's getting old and may well have some substance problems. But I don't want for you to come away from this slide with the idea that too many rows of pollen is an indication of loss of substance. It is not. The things, this says it accurately, I guess. If you have more rows of pollen, it indicates that the bloom is overly mature and it may be losing substance, but that substance is only apparent if you have soft and wilting ray florets. So in my mind, I wouldn't have done this slide that way, but if you see lots of pollen in an open cultivar, you might want to be more conscious that you could have substance problems with that entry. Do you agree with that, Tony?
Oh, completely. You know, I personally wish the ADS would get off the 2 to 3 rows of pollen, because a lot of our open centers, I think, are actually prettier with more pollen and they hold
some more pollen.
Yeah.
Right.
Agree completely.
So that's a very subtle point. So don't get too hung up on that one. This is far less subtle. You see the shriveling and the graying of those ray florets, particularly around the back of this white, and I don't know if that would be laciniate or not, probably not, just has split tips, but it sure has trouble with substance in the back there. Similarly here, you see in the back half of the bloom, droopy petals, and they're dropping below in back of the equator there. Whoops, sorry about that. Similarly here, a drooping and graying of the petals at the back of the ray floret. One of the things that is still a little controversial is that I guess this is saying that even at a show, you can gently touch the back of the ray florets to see if they are still springy or to see if they are soft. Frankly, I'm a little uncomfortable doing that, and I would prefer that you as judges don't do much of it, only if it's very difficult to tell visually. Then you might want to take a pencil and just kind of nudge the back of it, because you don't want to spoil it for the next person coming along looking at the balloon. So only touch it if you feel like you have to detect the lack of substance. I think we're switching now to good cake, good substance. Obviously, this has got good uniform surface texture, good shape and form and color, and no indication of droopiness on that bloom at all. So here's a summary of the faults: soft ray florets, missing ray florets laying on the table, as I said, lack of springiness of the ray florets, loss of shape of the bloom that is starting to wilt and drop, and wilted and droop, thin or falling. Those are faults. Well, that's the end. So we didn't go back over the majority, but let me keep going. Okay, next up is stem. And you see a lot of good examples of stem in there. Maybe one here on the left that's not so great, a little crooked and a little long, but some good examples of good solid stems there. Okay, we'll talk about the ideal proportion, and that's an interesting topic, and it's nicely displayed here in my view. Okay, vocabulary, that's important, because at least in part because it serves as a basis for the conversations in a judging team, and you do want to be able to use the accurate terminology so that you can discuss your observations with your team effectively. The stem is that part of the support of the bloom between the first set of leaves and the bloom itself. Gosh, I lost my pointer. There we go. And the receptacle up here. So first pair of leaves and the receptacle. The stalk, by comparison, is that portion of the support of the bloom. Oops, what did I do? Skip receptacle, sorry. Well, the stalk is the part of the stem below that first set of leaves. The receptacle is the attachment point between the stem and the bloom itself. Okay, let's go on now to crotched. This is a good picture of the definition of crotched. The bloom is setting right down in the foliage because the stem is just way too short. That's referred to as a crotched or a crotchy bloom. Patina is the kind of gray substance that you see on the surface of many blooms. Some not so much, but some show a lot. The ones that show a lot are often difficult to handle because you don't want to have your fingerprints all over the bloom. So sometimes I end up in a show situation of actually rubbing that off because it's difficult to keep it uniform and clean. Natural gray powder substance found on the stems. And it isn't, sometimes it's not at all obvious, sometimes it is. Stem proportion is important. I think this is a kind of a lousy picture, except obviously the proportion there is not good. Here's I think, an effective illustration of stem proportion, illustrating the combined effective appearance of a pair of leaves, the length of the stem, and the size of the bloom. And you want that to be in good proportion. We used to say that it used to be 1.5 times the spread of the leaves, but apparently that's no longer in vogue. I don't know whether that's in the manual anymore or not, but we used to say that this distance from here to here used to be 1.5 times this spread. And that's approximately what that would be. Close anyway. Here's a good example of the proportion. That's the spread of the leaves and the up to the receptacle, up to the center of the bloom. Here is an example where that the foliage is too small or the stem is too long or a little bit of both, but it does not have a visually pleasing appearance. Similarly here, just the other way around, the bloom is right down in the foliage. And this just makes the point that if you're looking at two different blooms in competition, which obviously this wouldn't be the case, a good proportion does make a much more pleasant appearing entry than super long stems like that one has. The stem, it should be straight, round, smooth, of adequate diameter and length to achieve that nice proportion that we saw a few slides ago. That also shows the patina on the stem. This one's 10 points. You're looking for stems that are as faults now, crooked, too long, too short, too thick, too thin, or enter the bloom off center. And I'll show you that in just a second. So here is a too long and kind of wavy stem. Here's one that's too short. Another one that's so short you don't even see it. And this is considered to be a fault. In my mind, it's not a particularly severe one, but you do see stems and stalk, I guess in this case, that is not smooth. It's ridged, and that's not good, but I certainly consider it to be a minor fault. This tends to be a more severe fault where the stem is not entering the bloom at its center. So in the case on the left, it is the stem is coming up on the left side of the center. And in this particular case, the stem is coming up on the front side of the bloom instead of right into the center of the bloom. And that can cause symmetry faults, like this would aid in a symmetry fault to have that bloom that far off center. More faults. I guess they're saying this is too thick, and this one, I guess, is too thin. Again, a relatively subtle fault compared to too long, too short, or too crooked. Like this one, weak and rubbery faults. You get into you can get into crooked stems where there is a spur leaf, and this shows two examples of that. If you have a spur leaf without a crooked stem, that's just fine. But if that causes or is associated with a bend in the stem, then that is a fault. Here's an example where they're not round. You can see that one's kind of egg-shaped. Mechanical damage is relatively uncommon. Unfortunately, the very late disbudding can cause poor-looking stem. Okay, here's the question. The stem is the structure above the rim of the show container. Everybody knows that is false.
False. False.
False, right. The stem is that portion above above the first set of leaves. This is the stem. This is the stalk down here. Stem can cause poor bloom position if it connects into the bloom at an angle like this one clearly does, or if it causes the bloom to tip over because it's too weak. So you can have bloom position problems associated with stem issues. Careful selection of good quality blooms on strong straight stems of good proportion can enhance an entry. And that was, I think that's literally the same example that we had a couple slides back. Okay, faults in summary, faulty disbudding, which I would put it down near the end of the list. The ones that you see more commonly are too short, too small, too long, crotched, crooked, multiple stems. You do see that sometimes where they're like joined together, wiry and weak, and does not meet the bloom squarely. Okay, I don't know, maybe that's the last one again. Yeah, it is. Okay, I'm just going to keep going unless somebody have an urgent question. Yeah, I'm going to keep going. I hope you're making a couple notes because I think we're going to be through this relatively quickly. One of the wonderful things about dahlias is the foliage, and this is a nice picture that shows the tremendous variety in color and form that you have in dahlia foliage. So this is an interesting module in my mind. We'll talk about foliage and how it enhances an entry, the formations, various formations, the good qualities, and the desired proportion. Again, we get back to that issue of the proportion among the bloom and the stem and the foliage. Okay, we're going to talk about the vocabulary again. This is a simple leaf. It's basically just a single leaf. The next one is compound leaf, and this is seven leaflets on that compound leaf. The node is that point where the leaf joins the stem or the stalk. It's enlarged. Pair of leaves are shown here. They both come out from the same node. So that's the difference between, can be the difference between a pair of leaves and a set of leaves. A set of leaves can come from different nodes. That's next up. Here's an example of a set of leaves coming from two different nodes. And they can be a set as long as they are within an inch of each other. If they're further than an inch apart, then it becomes like a stair step of leaves up the stem without a pair. Spur leaf, I talked about just a minute ago. That just shows a single leaf at the back of the stem. This is an example where it doesn't affect the straightness of that stem at all. And it is between the receptacle and that first set of leaves. Okay, next 10 points for leaves. You're looking for leaves that are, from the point of view of faults, again, too small, too large. They need to be identical, and they are best if they are opposite each other on the stem. That is, a set of leaves are disadvantaged over a pair of leaves. Okay, color, formation, substance, and proportion are all considerations when you're comparing the value and the evaluating foliage. Again, a nice selection of various similar quality foliage in that slide. And again, other comparisons actually have some, missing the terminology. What's the right term for that? Pickety, almost, appearance of those leaves. And again, back to the comparison of simple, compound, and 5 times compound in those two cases. They can be finely divided and they can be heavily serrated. Lots of various forms of foliage. But from the point of view of faults, you want to have paired. The size and shape of the leaves, whether simple or compound, should be uniform. That is, this is a fault to have an unmatched set of leaves. Even this, I guess, is a pair of leaves, and they're coming out at the same node. But it's better to have a pair that are the same, single leaf of the single leaf, or compound leaf of the compound leaf. Okay, back to quizzes. In dahlia foliage, what color and formation is preferred? And I hope you all picked up all of them.
All of them.
There you go. Exactly right. As long as they are have good health, and we'll get back to that in a minute, because as you probably recognize, the Midwest and the DSO in particular are well-versed in virus and how to detect it in foliage. So we'll get back to that in a minute. Oops. Okay. Okay, ideally each leaf in a pair will have equal and opposite leaves, and they will have a shared node on the stem. A set, again, as I said, isn't a pair. They can be a set as long as they are less than an inch apart. They won't share the same stem. Okay, that's just the same point. Yeah, and if they're further an inch apart, then they're like a stair step along the stem or the stalk. And that is a fault. Next, next quiz. True or false? Leaves need to be directly opposite from each other, 180 degrees apart. Actually, I need to tell them there's a typo there. On a stem to be considered a pair of leaves, and that everybody knows is not true. Pair of leaves at the same share the same node, but they may not be perfectly opposite one another. It's best if they are literally opposite one another. So if you had two that are close together instead of being opposite, it is a fault. Okay, here's that poor picture again, where that has a poor relationship among the foliage, the stem, and the size of the bloom. So that's a poor example. Here we are back to a good example with the stem and the width of the leaves and the size of the bloom in good proportion, in pleasing proportion. Bad example again, foliage too long for the stem. Two more bad examples where the foliage is here too small and they're too big. Okay, now onto the spur leaf. At one point in time, I think back far enough, a spur leaf used to be always a negative, but that's not true and shouldn't be true, because if you have a long stem and you have a spur leaf coming out the back of a long stem, it can help to break that up and actually enhance the appearance of the bloom, particularly standing back. It will enhance, can enhance, because it's big and ugly and off to the side or sticking straight out front, and then it's a fault for sure. Okay, this is again a crotchy bloom, short stem and foliage going right up into the bloom, so that's obviously a fault. Here's the example of that poor disbudding and has mechanical damage. I guess that's over here. Again, another example of poor disbudding. Another thing that we often see, and particularly I would say in multiple bloom entries where you're trying to get the right height of each of the blooms, you do see instances where foliage has been removed from the stalk in this case, and that is a fault. And in my mind, the severity of that fault is kind of in proportion to how obvious it is. And in this case, it's pretty obvious. So that's a fairly severe fault. Next. Oh, too thick or too coarse. I guess I would, depends on the severity. It's not something that it shows itself much in shows in my mind. However, you do see insect problems and disease problems on foliage, and that is a severe fault. And in fact, the one that troubles me most is virus in the leaves, and I'll show you an example of that in a minute. Powdery mildew, any kind of infestation disease, water damage. Water damage, I don't tend to think of as anything very severe, but apparently there's an insect laying on the ground under that one that showed leaf damage. So that obviously would be a substantial fault. Okay, here's the virus issue. This is the kind of damage that we see most frequently in the Midwest, yellowing along the veins. And that is a characteristic that's unique to a virus problem, and it ought to be treated as a substantial fault. And it is increasingly, that's increasingly the case, I think, all across the Midwest and across the country, not just the Midwest. Okay, desirable characteristics: good, healthy, clean green, proportion in relation to the bloom. Just picture those images with the triangles on them. Compound leaf that has all leaflets alike, that is a triple opposite. A 7 is not as good as a triple opposite triple. Adequate proportion leaf surface, I guess that just means large enough leaves. And leaf pattern the same on opposite sides of the stalk. Faults, inadequate foliage, crinkled, folded, loss of substance, turgidity. I would put that under substance, not under foliage, but substance issues show up as damage in the bloom and in foliage. Damage by slugs, insects, whatever. Too large, too small. Discolored, coarse, thin, not uniform in position or formation. Surface raised and bubble-like formation. In my mind, we should have had virus appearance right in the middle of this one. That happens not to be there. Okay. That's the end of foliage. Should I pause for a minute? Anybody? What time is it? 7:37. Oh, we're making good time, I think. Bloom position. That's a relatively easy one, although I guess I'm going to say here, one of my pet peeves used to be a confusion in the value of bloom position versus the value of a color fault or a form fault or something of that should be of significantly greater portion. Bloom positions is really easy to see. That is it aiming up, or is it aiming down, or is it off to the side, or is it at that ideal 45-degree position? So a relatively easy thing to see, but that doesn't mean that you should immediately reach conclusions about setting entries to the back of the table because the bloom position isn't good, because all of these issues that we're talking about today are relatively less significant than form and color. So just be careful with keeping that perception in mind as you are judging. Bloom position is just one that I have had some experiences that I disagreed with. So anyhow, as long as you keep in mind that its total value here is 10 points, and it is a relatively less important fault. Okay, more than enough of my prejudices here. Bloom position is important. Okay, let's talk about the down-facing bloom is the worst case, where it actually, the bloom, instead of looking at you, is literally facing down. Side facing is one that you see fairly often, and it is certainly a fault. It's not nearly as severe a fault as down facing. Okay, and then top facing, and we'll get back in a minute to the fact that top facing is okay in a certain set of the ball blooms and water lilies. Those top facing is not a penalty in those particular forms. Ideally, though, it should be at 45 degrees. And I guess that is a good example where that bloom is looking right up at 45 degrees. And here is a good example of a multiple entry where all of those blooms are looking up at the observer at 45 degrees. And it certainly does enhance the appearance of the multiple bloom entry, for example, in particular. Bloom position is approximately 45 degrees relevant. Good, another good example. 10 points again is the total value. Used to be, well, we won't do that. 10 points. Used to be less than that. Faults, as I said before, down facing is a severe fault. Side facing, less severe. Top facing is a fault. I think, well, let me just get to that. For palms, miniature balls, and balls, and water lilies, because, like, for example, water lily natural position would be top facing. And palm miniature balls and balls are round, and top facing shouldn't make much of a difference. Or I was about to digress a minute ago, is that on large blooms, top facing can be I guess a net positive, because it can have the tendency to reduce the extent to which a bloom begins to droop. If it's setting right up on top, it won't develop characteristics we called bearding, which means that the lower part of the bloom has florets that are longer, that appear longer than the ones on the top. So top-facing big bloom can have a nicer appearance than one at 45. Well, that was approximately instant. Okay, then we have two more. Uniformity is the characteristic that we use in show bench evaluation and seedling bench evaluation. Floriferousness, on the other hand, is the characteristic that we consider in trial gardens. So you don't consider both when you're doing an evaluation. This is only true for trial garden evaluation. This is only true in show bench evaluation. So let's go through the uniformity. That just means it's important, right? We're going to talk about faults and we'll talk about faults and good characteristics as well. So uniformity is a judging characteristic that is applied when you're looking at seedling bench and multiple bloom entries. Its value is 10 points, and it pertains just to shows and seedlings. And uniformity pertains to all of the characteristics, that is, bloom position, foliage, stem, substance, size, form, and color. So if you have variations in uniformity of any of those characteristics, it is a uniformity fault. And I think we'll see some examples here. I guess that just literally says the same thing, except this is show bench. This is a 7 bloom entry on the show bench. The preceding one was a 3 bloom entry on the seedling bench. Same issues though. You evaluate on the show bench all of those characteristics. And before I move it, is there any one that leaps out at you here? How about the size of this one? Isn't that about 2/3 of the size of the rest of them? Wonder if that was meant to be a good example. In any case, that is a fault as we see it in this picture on this entry. The bloom is smaller than the rest, and that is a fault. Okay. Oh, this is, maybe those were both show entries. Here are people doing a seedling bench evaluation at a West Coast show. These are Washington folks here. Okay, here's an example of not such a hot entry. That one's a little harder to tell. Additional emphasis to be put on presentation, including bloom position, spacing, and arrangement. Yeah. If they are, well, we'll get to that. One more on that point. The entries on a multiple bloom entry should not touch each other. They should have their own space. As in here, they should be equidistant from one another. That first crack looks like a pretty good example of good uniformity. Maybe that position is a little different from the rest. That one too, I suppose. And that, like a lot of characteristics, you need to be sensitive to uniformity in open-centered varieties. You need to look at the individual blooms as well as the overall entry for uniformity. And I think that's the next slide. Yeah, are the florets equal in size and form? Are the florets equally spaced and arranged in a flat plane? Do the florets display even color distribution? That's particularly true on a multiple color a blend or a bicolor. And does the disc pollen show uniform level of maturity? And again, as Tony said earlier, he and I share the view that the number of rows aren't important, but from the point of view of, in this case, you would want them to be as close as possible. And frequently, the simplest way to solve that problem is to have zero. You have zero, then it's then they match pretty well, relatively easily. Okay, uniformity faults, lack of uniform color or form. Those are obviously the big ones. Difference in size, difference in bloom position, difference in stem lengths, leaf shapes not uniform. But even here, if you had a mix of single leaves and triplets and fives, that it would be a fault. Relatively subtle by that point. Here's some poor uniformity. Let's look at the spacing here, look at the size, look at the spacing here. Again, bigger bloom here, smaller one there. Oh, check your knowledge. Okay, what kind of uniformity faults do you see here? It's funny though, the one that so dominated my perspective here when I first did this was the colors. Just colors on the left two blooms are just looks like a different cultivar almost. But there are also differences in maturity. If you look at the bloom centers, you see less center there, more center here, probably less center on that one up there. I think they also point out size. Let's just go on to what they say. Oh, bloom position. Yeah, this bloom position is different from that one. Obviously the color. Okay, next. The end. Okay, I'm gonna go on to floriferousness, and there's only about 4 slides in that one, so we're almost done. Floriferousness is basically determining whether or not a particular cultivar puts out enough blooms to make it worthwhile to have in your garden. And these are obviously a couple of good examples of plenty of blooms on those two cultivars. And again, it is only a trial garden characteristic. And it is worth 10 points in the trial gardens. Very few blooms, or sometimes blooms that are too late, can also be an issue. And that is something that does come up because, you know, our trial gardens are located in different climates. And in some cases, the climate isn't particularly susceptible to creating a large enough number of blooms early enough. So that is an issue that we get into in different cases, different trial gardens. Okay, determined by the number of blooms, exposed laterals, spent blooms, and buds. That is when you're evaluating that, you need to be looking at it over a period of time. So that buds, lots of buds there, and spent blooms, they need to be considered when you're talking about the ability to gather an entry from a plant. Considerations committee number, yeah, okay, same story. Lots of buds, spent blooms that were there. That one probably a week ago. Some more recent. That was just relatively recently opened to center. Okay, faults, overall too few blooms, or blooms that are too late for the show times, or too few quality blooms. Sometimes you have a mix of a range of quality on a plant, and some of them just wouldn't ever qualify to be on a show table. So that again is a floriferousness penalty, floriferousness problem. Okay, we're done. Wow. Okay. I hope that was more effective than trying to skip through it like I did before. So let's just open it up, and I'm happy to go back and look at individual. Let's let me continue to share screen for a moment, because I might want to go back to one of the modules. So
Right. So
questions.
there's like 20 questions in the chat. I'm just gonna start with the first one. Whether having the patina on an exhibit versus an exhibit without, would that be less points? So is it better to totally remove the patina?
I would say what I do is, if I have messed up the patina, I will wipe it. I will wipe the stem. If I haven't messed up the patina, then I will try to leave it alone. Frankly, I don't think I can. I mean, it's certainly not something that comes up very often. Tony, leap in there, Tony. What do you think?
And I've never heard anyone discuss patina. And I think a lot of senior judges don't even know what patina is, but it is there. It's hard to, it's not that delicate. I think if it's there, it can add to the beauty of the bloom. But I've never heard anyone discuss it as a fault or a positive in all my years.
Yep, it's a very tiny issue.
Okay. Can a specimen have leaves removed early in the growing stages to enhance the stem length?
I view no.
I
think it's very
well, unless they're referring to when you have the 3 sets of buds, and there's a lot of people who will, if the stem length isn't long enough, they will select a side bloom and take out the center and one of the laterals to increase stem length. I don't personally practice that very much, because I don't care how good you are, usually you can see it. But that's not to say there aren't exhibitors that are more highly skilled than I am, but maybe that's what you're referring to. When you have 3 buds, terminal buds, and you select a side bud rather than the central bud to try to extend stem length on crotchy varieties.
Okay. At what point is there too much foliage on an entry? According to Tony, never happened.
Depends on whether you're at the East Coast or the West Coast.
I'd like to just comment on
Yeah,
that
go ahead.
if I could. And in some of these, some of these pictures that we saw where you had one little leaf on one side, and then you had a set of leaves exactly opposite of it. And if you exhibit that bloom, so picture the bloom in your mind, and on the set of the pair of leaves, one has just a single leaf, but the other one has 3 leaves, like 3 leaflet. A lot of times, if you exhibit that entry with 2 sets of leaves, you're going to take the judge's eye off that pretty severe fault with foliage. So in answer to your question about what's the ideal, number of sets of leaves, it's going to be the one that enhances the bloom the most. Sometimes it's 1, most of the time it's 2, in my opinion. Occasionally it's 3. And we all have had these blooms that come on, and the leaves are looking right at you. So you picture the pair of leaves, and one's going away from you and one's coming straight at you. Well, if you exhibit the second leaf, they're going to be in the opposite direction, and that's going to really save that entry on the show bench. Most judges aren't going to really fault that as heavily as if you just showed it with 1 set of leaves. I hope this makes sense. You're following me. Does everybody follow that?
I think that says it very well, Tony. Yeah, we I would say out on the West Coast, they very much tend to have just a single pair of leaves. And I think that our blooms in the Midwest and in the East are more attractive because I think the tendency is to show two pairs more than one. And I think it's a better looking entry because you have, the opportunity to have 4 directions for the leaves, and I think it sets the bloom off best.
I
So
completely agree.
I don't very often go to 3, but lots of good exhibitors do.
We used to exhibit more commonly. 3 were more common than 2 30, 40 years ago. And we used to have the rule that if you had great foliage, show it off. But a lot depends too on, for your young growers in the node length, if your second set of leaves, if we've had a lot of water and it's too long, it throws the bloom out of proportion. So you want that second set of leaves to be a little closer to the first set rather than longer, or else you should probably take it off because it's not as pleasing to the eye. And then the second comment was on tri-leaf. Some dahlias actually grow with tri-leaves where the node actually has 3. Instead of just having a pair, it has a triplet coming off. We had a little bit of discussion when we did the guide about that. I personally think that some of those entries are just beautiful because you actually have like a vase of foliage drawing your eye to the bloom. So you actually have a three sets of leaves or 3 pairs around that. So I think it actually frames it better. So I wouldn't get too much in the weeds with punishing this stuff. The bottom line on foliage, if it enhances the bloom, it's probably good and shouldn't be faulted that much. If it doesn't enhance the bloom and it's out of proportion, then you got to fault it. That's besides all the obvious faults, which are virus, insect damage, all that. So, I mean, when you're looking at foliage, it's really there to enhance that bloom and to frame that bloom.
I guess, Tony, maybe just to complement that, if you include it, it will be judged. So you want to be fairly comfortable that it is enhancing the entry overall.
If you've got a second set of leaves and the thing's cracked off, you better take it off.
Better just take it off.
Because they're going to judge it and they're going to fault it. So just take it off completely. But it's a judgment call. Is it a net positive or a net negative?
Okay, next question. Is the receptacle the same as the calyx? Or I think I'm saying that right.
I think, at least as I understand it, the calyx are the set of leaves that enclose the receptacle. Isn't that true? I guess I'm not sure, 100%.
I think that's right. I think that's where the receptacle is where the calyxes come off. I don't know technically if they include that or not, but you're on the right track. That's what it is.
The part of the reason I say that is, as maybe most of you know, if you remove those calyx petals from a palm, you end up with a better looking palm because the calyx leaves don't get in the way, and it folds back around more nicely than if you left those calyx on the receptacle.
Okay. Should you remove the spur leaf for judging?
Me, no. In general, I think they end up as a net positive as opposed to a net negative, and that because if you take it off, most judges will see that it has been removed, and then you kind of need to imagine it as ugly enough to have needed to be taken off.
What about the
Hey.
old sandpaper trick Tony taught?
That Tony's the only guy I know who can handle that.
With scalpels and sandpaper, I think there's whether to take them off or not strictly depends on whether if the stems needs that spur leaf for balance, depending on the next, your true pair of leaves that's underneath it and the length of the stem, you have to leave. If the spur leaf is touching the bloom, it has to come off because that's really distracting. And if it's too low to the first pair of leaves, it has to come off. But if it's in the middle and it looks balanced, you could leave it. If it's in the back and your stem is long and you curl it up, it actually draws your eye to the stem. So that is the answer to that question is it depends. I would, and then a lot of times, and Ron alluded to this, especially with the open centers, every place there's a set of leaves, or a lot of times, especially with a spur leaf, that stem wants to take an obtuse angle at that spur leaf. And sometimes you can get away with that if it's looking directly at the viewer. And if you take it off, it accentuates that crook in the stem. So again, you have to kind of, when you're staging your dahlias and you're thinking about how much to fault the spur leaf, when you're staging, you have to decide whether it's going to make it worse by taking it off. And as a judge, if you leave it on, sometimes it's perfectly acceptable. I never fault them if I think they are a neutral or they enhance a bloom. So they're not an automatic penalty by any means. They used to call them pig's ear. I don't know if we left that in the guide or not, but that was kind of a very derogatory term decades ago when people had a very negative impression of them. So instead of calling them spur leaves, they were almost universally referred to as pig leaves or pig ears.
I don't think it's in there, Tony.
I think we took it out.
All right.
It was in one of the slides.
Was it? I'll be there on that.
I'm pretty sure.
Referred to it. Yeah, well, sure, and it must still be in there then.
All right. On a specimen where all is even, except one has opposite leaves and the other has leaves within 1 inch of each other, would the opposite leaves specimen rank higher?
Yes.
Okay, that was a quick answer. All right. Multiple bloom categories. Do they require all specimens be in the same container, or can an exhibitor exhibit in separate containers?
The DSO requires all in the same container.
Okay. Does
And
have you ever been to a show?
I know that in Australia, that's not always the case. That is, they have entries with 8 or 10 blooms, and they can be in separate containers. But gee, unless somebody knows differently, I think all of our Midwest shows require multiple bloom entries in the same container.
But wasn't there a show recently where they were separate?
There was, Jerry. It was the Midwest, out in Elkhart. Remember
Elkhart. Yeah.
I think it was even a seedling entry.
Yeah.
And I don't remember what they did with it.
I don't remember either.
I remember talking about it, but you're right. And I think it was a seedling bench entry.
So they entered it that way, but that wasn't the correct way.
I think that's right, Jess. Yeah, I think that's.
All right. It seems that the show winners all have 2 sets of leaves, but it doesn't seem to be a scoring criteria. How do you factor this in?
I think Tony said that pretty well. The 2 pair entries were probably more attractive than the single pair entries.
Okay.
I mean, I don't think anybody is prejudicing the entries on the basis of the number of pairs of leaves. They're trying to determine what the best entry is, and in many cases, the second pair of leaves enhances the entry. Now, you appreciate that that's not necessarily what would happen in different shows across the country.
Okay. Some categories could overlap with each other when evaluating an entry. For example, a down-facing bloom could be caused by a weak stem. Would you deduct points from both areas?
That's a tough question.
Coletta's coming for you. She question, Coletta.
I guess in a way, the answer is yes. You could fault it for both. I mean, I guess I wouldn't fault it heavily for both, but you see lots of overlap. Substance, substance being one. I mean, they pointed out that it affects both the form and the color, and so just how you choose to score there is a difficult question. In other words, you're talking about differences between 84 and 86 making a huge difference on the bloom. So long years of experience, maybe. I don't know. Tony, Jerry.
I would just like to chime in that I hate to expose inconsistencies between the modules and the guide, but if you notice in the guide, there's really abbreviated. The modules are doing a much better job, I think, of going into detail on a lot of this stuff. The stem, for example, the stem portion of the guide has nothing to do about the bloom being on center. And the reason for that is really supposed to be a form fault.
Yeah.
But the truth of the matter is, when most judges judge symmetry, they judge symmetry from the center of the bloom. So they're looking at the center and they're saying if it's a symmetric bloom around the center. They're not looking from a distance to see if it's on center with the stem. So it's always made more sense to me forever to have it as a stem fault rather than a symmetry fault. But if you look in the guide, the fault is under symmetry and it's not mentioned at all under stem. I don't think as a judge it matters, but you should score that. If that bloom is an inch off center, that's a severe fault. If it's a ½ inch, it's a moderate fault. If it's a ¼ inch off, it's a minor fault. But I mean, it's definitely a fault. And it's one that I feel a lot of judges just miss. They miss it because they don't step back far enough and get in front of the bloom. Your nose has to be right on the center of the bloom, and you have to look and make sure that that stem comes right up like an arrow into the center and it's not off one way or the other. A lot of judges will pick that fault up when they turn the bloom around and see the hook. They'll see a hook in the stem from the back, especially on your cactuses. On your formal decoratives and your ID, sometimes you can't see where that stem enters the bloom and you're gonna miss that. So a lot of these FDs and IDs are actually off center and it's missed by judges. So the way to evaluate it, whether you evaluate it under stem or form, is to stand in front of it from a distance, put your nose on the center of that and see if the stem meets in the center. When you turn it around, if it was off from the front, you'll validate your observation by looking at the back because you'll see the hook if it's a cactus. And that's what you'll see too when you look from the side and some of these are off. These stems hook. And when they hook, there's a fault, I think rightfully so under stem rather than symmetry. But that's just my opinion, even though it's different in the book than it is in the module. So any of you who've picked up that inconsistency, good for you.
But you know, Tony, when I look at a bloom, I put my arm straight up from the stem up through the bloom, the center of the bloom.
Yeah.
And you see that one half is substantially more on one side is substantially more than the other. I would consider that a symmetry.
Well, I think it's probably the way we look at it. You know, that's interesting to me. I usually take my pen or my pencil and actually put it along, and I'll show judges, you know, how it's off and how much it's off, you know, by doing that. And like I said, I don't think it depends on, you know, when we judge our shows, we don't have a scorecard where you're going to score stem and you're going to score form. This gets more important when you get into the trial gardens. Okay. And we'll talk about that, you know, in 2 weeks, as to whether you deduct that from stem or you deduct it from form. There's a lot more points to deduct from form. So, you know, I kind of like that, because I think personally, I don't think we value our stems, foliage, and bloom angle as much as we should.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Misty, this next one was yours, and I think you're gonna have to guide us to where in the presentation you were talking about. So you asked what variety something was, and then how much does the foliage matter in that entry of Honka?
Oh, yeah. So that variety was that purple, with that dark purple foliage, that cultivar. I'll see if I can pick it up.
Is it in this module?
It was really pretty. Let me just see here. I can try to get it back. But the Honka was in the multi-bloom one. Like the multi-bloom, and it had like foliage. I just kind of wanted to know, how much does the foliage matter when you're doing the multi-bloom? You know, because you could clearly see it wasn't hidden by any other foliage or anything. It wasn't like a basket. And I was just curious as to, like, you know, how do you, and I think maybe one more down, Jess, is the Honka. Yeah.
Oh, Ron's driving. He's in charge.
How do you weigh that foliage, whether it's uniform or not, you know? Or does it, because the Honkas look great, maybe some slight, you know, curve in the one.
I guess, Missy, I would mean, if you're judging, are you wanting to know about uniformity or about the foliage?
Well, I guess the foliage matters in the uniformity, right? Because they want to take every part into consideration. And so,
yes, that's true.
You know, where I know the bloom probably matters more, but if I'm comparing like this basket to or this multi-bloom arrangement to another multi-bloom, and I see, you know, maybe that Honka on the right and the back the foliage looks a little bit not as dense. I don't know. Does that matter? Maybe I'm looking at the weeds too much, but you know.
Not at all, Misty. I think you're right on the button, man. When you're judging those multi-bloom entries and you pick up something like that, that's definitely uniformity, because, you know, you've got more foliage on one side of the exhibit than you have on the other. So it's really not uniform. So I think you have to evaluate everything when you're talking about uniformity.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Yeah. Yeah, each of the characteristics need to be uniform. So if you see differences in the foliage or differences in the color or differences in the size, whatever characteristic you're looking at, they're supposed to be the same. I don't see in that entry what you're talking about, but maybe it's because it's just relatively subtle compared to the blooms.
What's making me crazy is there's 11 of them.
Oh, yeah.
Just that cultivar was the one in the uniformity in the show bench. So that was that I don't know, was it a cactus with a kind of purple bloom and a purple foliage? It was just striking. I've never one more up or two more up. Yeah, one more up. There you go. It looks like a purple foliage as well. It is an interesting shape.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is, isn't it?
Tell you what
I don't know what it is.
you can
Well,
email.
maybe is that a different foliage than the actual plant? I don't know. Sorry.
It kind of looks it, doesn't it?
Maybe
No, I
it's
think
something totally different. Yeah, maybe it's like hiding. Okay, never mind.
That's the one where I talked about that would be different in size, isn't it? Oh.
Okay. On considerations for uniformity, how are points for faults determined? So you fault 1 point, 2 points, etc.
I'll tell you what I do. I always kind of think of what would be a passing score, which would be 8.5. And then I consider it, is that characteristic, whichever one it is that a passing score or a passing fault or a fault that's severe enough that we ought to flunk it. So that's how I start to get my point penalty in mind. Does that answer the question?
Or
Yeah, that answered the question for me.
Okay.
But
All right.
on the same picture, I had another question, the next question too. So,
and I think Ron, this might be on the slide with the honka.
yeah.
The one picture in uniformity shows exhibiting in man, you're really challenging my pronunciation, kokedama or moss ball, and the others in vases. Is that the kokedama a proper manner to exhibit smaller dahlia exhibits? So the little ball up front, Ron, that's kind of what.
This one?
Yep. So that's not a vase, that's like a moss ball.
Yeah.
Which I think is cool, but.
It is cool.
You have to read your show schedule. Some show schedules won't allow that. Others say you can use your own container. I can't stress enough. You have to read the show schedule for every single show. If you don't, you're going to get burned because somebody could actually throw. I agree, it's pretty. Somebody will throw that out if it says it has to be staged in a society vase.
Well, my question was, is that the cut flowers actually put in the ball, or is that the actual flowers with the roots and everything?
Oh, I think it has to be staged.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
I think. I mean, I don't think you'd get any plant naturally growing to display like that.
I think not that many at the same time either. But you're not wrong.
Good trick.
You're not wrong. Those moss balls, you can grow plants directly out of them. So like, I could see where you're coming from. It is feasible to do it. I just think like you would probably need a couple tubers, maybe 3 in that moss ball to even try to get where that is.
It looks like to me that it's floral foam with moss attached to it.
Yeah, it might be.
It looks like the Spanish moss is like in on top of it, and it like there's a container on the bottom. And I wonder, does that moss distract from the thing? Like if you were judging it, does it take it away? Like because they're hiding the foam?
Not if Jess is judging it. Jess gives you credit. No.
But the key is whether or not the schedule allows you to do that.
Well, if it's in the vase category, I would say it's charming. If it's in the multi-bloom category, I would say
Probably
it
not.
probably doesn't fit the rules.
Probably not allowed, yeah.
But back to Tony's thing, you got to read carefully.
Okay, so that was all the questions in the chat. Who else has questions?
Okay, I have a question. I was curious again on this uniformity. There was the slide that says uniformity in open centers. Judges should adopt a more demanding perspective when evaluating uniformity for open center varieties. Why more demanding than like fully doubles? Like to me, you know, am I missing something? Like shouldn't yeah.
Slide numbers up for Ron.
Oh, I screenshotted these and I saved them. So it's uniformity and open centered varieties. It's the
Yeah.
one, like it's down 13, Jess. Yeah. Or yeah, 13. Why would it be more demanding for open centers over fully doubles?
I think I put that kind of in the same perspective that I do in evaluating the form of open-centered cultivars, because you have so much less to judge. I mean, you only have 8 florets, and if you have a different gap in one of the quadrants or one of the 8s around that bloom, and if you multiplied that into a 3-dimensional situation, it would be gross. So I think you just need to be very sensitive to looking at the distribution of those ray florets around an open-centered cultivar, because you're putting a lot of points on a relatively small feature. So that's how I understand the comment. Now, as far as uniformity, that's kind of a step back, and it may be it is more strongly put than I would have put it if I were writing this, because you know, I think uniformity is kind of a step away from the specifics of the form of the individual blooms. So I don't know, maybe that says that probably says I'm not sure. I don't know the answer, I guess, Misty.
No, but that makes sense though that you would look at the gaps more, and there's less petals in there. So that does make sense to me, Ron. You know.
Yeah, okay. Well, you're just drawing conclusions or evaluations on a lot smaller amount of material. So I think you need to be not more forgiving.
I have a question about the staging process of your like 3 blooms. I see some always have the center forward and then 2 in the back, or vice versa. Is that just a preference, or are there rules to how to stage those?
I'm going to let Tony handle that one. He's so much better at it than I am.
That you know, and I stage mine different all the time. You've got to I think the best way to stage 3 dahlias is to put them all in 3 separate vases, even though you can't exhibit them like that, to evaluate what you have. And then you decide where they need to go. And the best example I could give you, and it was in one of those slides where Ron made the comment that they were pretty uniform, except the one at the top was top facing. Well, why in the world that guy didn't take that one at the top and put it at the bottom so the judge was looking down on it? He would have never noticed it was top facing, or he may have noticed, but it wouldn't have taken away from the beauty of the exhibit. So if you have a top facing bloom, you want to stage it as low as possible so that the judge is still looking down on it. And the same thing where if you've got crooks in the stem, if you hold that dahlia out at 45 degrees when you're staging it, it'll either accentuate the crook or it'll correct it. So if you're lucky, you can correct it by putting it on one side or the other of the exhibit.
Okay.
And I'll be around at these shows, hopefully, guys, to help you with stuff like that, you know, because it is a bit of an art, you know, how to use them. But I think the way to start out always, if you've got 3 good blooms, is put them in an individual vase,
Okay.
look at them and decide how you're going to arrange them.
Thank you, Tony.
Sure.
Tammy, didn't Tony help you in the Cuyahoga Fair?
He did. It was beautiful.
Oh,
It
he
was
did.
embrace. Yes, it was. It was beautiful. He did. He was just working it, and yeah, it still amazes me how he worked that.
Didn't you win?
No,
Okay, I was gonna say.
Randy did. He had the Vasiomegas. Yes,
Oh, Randy coming in close.
Randy did.
Okay.
Well, sometimes good big dahlias will beat good little dahlias. I can't say I disagree with that either.
I had a question when they were talking about the trial garden. They said something about looking at the deadheads. I thought they deadheaded trial gardens.
Yeah, they're
were-
supposed
they were-
to.
Yeah, they were, I think, referring to the fact that if you don't get out there for a week, you got to just see how many blooms were there that you may have missed. That's the way I interpreted that slide. You're talking about with floriferousness.
Yeah.
Yeah, they were saying if you're not out, if you say you're like doing singles and you go out there and you may have missed them, you know, because they kind of flash and go, that you should look at how many, you know, you may have not seen bloom, but they were there, you know.
Okay.
I think it wasn't very clear. I felt the same way, Sharon, when I read it. What are they talking about? But I think that's what they meant.
I think you have to give them credit for blooms that are coming or that are past that, you know, would have been showable at one point in time. That you can't just look at blooms that are ready right at the moment that you're there.
Yeah, well said.
Thank you.
I had one comment. There was always kind of a sore spot with me, and you know, and I just wondered, you know, what Ron thinks about this. And I know we've got other senior judges on the call too, and just this kind of a exclamation point. It's always bothered me that, you know, and I couldn't really get enough people to agree that when you say that 45 degrees is preferred for all types, that implies to me that if you have a top-facing bloom, even if it's a water lily, or it's a palm, or it's a miniature ball, or it's a ball, although they say that that's acceptable, the module says it's actually okay.
On the couch?
I think it would have been best to say it's a more minor fault than it is on other form types. And that's what I was trying, that's how I interpret that myself. But there are people out there, I think where this stems from me is, if you look at a palm, if you're judging palms, and you're almost always going to be looking down on them. And because you're looking down on them, if it's top facing, they're still very attractive. In fact, it really, they're quite impressive because they're usually so perfect. But when you start judging, say, water lilies in balls, especially if they're taller, you're looking at the side of the bloom, which isn't very attractive. It's always better if the bloom looks at the viewer. And especially a lot of our ball varieties, the ones over 3.5 inches today, the stems are quite tall on these. They're not, you rarely look down on ball dahlias unless the guy only stages it with one little airplane sets of leaves. It'll oftentimes on our ball dahlia varieties that are popular, the sets of leaves are small. And so you're looking at a ball dahlia from the side, which I don't think is as attractive as looking at one from 45 degrees. So that being said, even though that's acceptable to have them top facing, I think there should be most of the judges agreed with this, that if you had 2 equal blooms and one was at 45 and one was top, you would give a nod to the 45. But I'm curious as to what other senior judges, how they feel about this. So I'd like to hear everybody else's opinion on that. That's judged a lot of shows.
Well, from my point of view, Tony, I usually find it not to be much of an issue, and that is, it's usually in fine tuning because you very, very seldom get a down facing or very, very seldom get a side facing bloom that is in contention for a top prize at the show, and therefore kind of anything from whatever the say 30 degrees up to top facing. I mean, any of those are relatively small differences that I don't think are of any great significance. Wow. That's now you can see my prejudice where I started on that one, that people are setting blooms back because they're top facing when they're maybe the best bloom in the show. So anyhow, that's my prejudice. Not much of a not particularly important top facing versus 45. Even on non-balls. Go ahead, Randy. Or Jim,
my comments would be that I don't beat a bloom up, especially large blooms, if they're a little bit top facing. Obviously the severity, I think you always got to weigh, the severity of all of these faults, but I'd sooner see a bloom a little bit to the top than to have to deal with a bearded situation. That's where I am basically. And, preferably, I mean, everybody has to realize that, your preference is 45 and as much as you can adhere to that. And that's going to be your honored bloom position that other blooms have to come up to.
Yeah, probably, well, down facing and side, maybe not quite as much, but down I would probably fail. In fact, I have failed. Top, I don't pay a whole lot of attention. I don't take much away from top facing. I can see it. I can see the bloom. That's what I want to do. If it's down facing, I can't see it.
Yeah. And some cultivars are just, you just can't get away with it because it's bred into the cultivar. I don't want to speak badly on some people, especially the new growers who grow Kelvin floodlight. I rarely see a Kelvin floodlight that isn't side facing, and but it still wins.
Yeah, big time. Hey Tony, I did have a question for you. I think you said that a pair of leaves, one of which is single and one of which is compound, is serious. Is it serious beyond 1.5 points?
Jerry, the only time I use point values is when I'm doing the seedling bench or trial garden evaluation. You know, when I'm looking at an exhibit, I guess my point with that is that, boy, if I would not show an exhibit that had one leaf and then a compound leaf opposite. I would try like hell to show two sets of leaves to distract you as a judge from looking at that. You know, my whole game when I exhibit is to really try to fool you. I want to take your eyes away from the faults that my stuff has. I want to trick you into to not noticing it as much, to take it away from it. I think if there's one thing that comes across, and we're blending judging in with, you know, staging and exhibiting, but I'm you know, it gets back to the thing that most of our judges, you'll be a better judge if you exhibit, and I want to teach you how to do both. And I think they're intertwined.
Sandy's having trouble getting off my something about settings.
I hope that makes sense.
Oh yeah, I understand it.
You know, that's what I was getting back to with foliage, is that you know, foliage has to enhance that bloom, and you know, a lot of times when you're showing one set of leaves, you're really limiting yourself as to what that first pair looks like. Whereas if you show two pairs, you're going to make it a lot more pleasing exhibit. But not always. If that second pair of leaves is real long, it really distracts. You know, so I mean, you have to look at it, you know, both ways, and decide when you're staging or exhibiting. And as a judge too, I mean, a lot of times, you know, we'll be judging an entry and somebody will comment, boy, it would have looked a lot better with, you know, without that second pair of leaves.
Yeah.
So you can't always assume that two pairs is better than one. But often it does save you if the first pair isn't very good.
Yeah.
And then you can use that second set sometimes to cover a bug hole in the first set if you arrange the leaves. You know, you can actually cover up your sins or insect damage or a break. I mean,
particularly on a multiple bloom entry, right?
Oh, for sure. For there, then you can start taking them off. You know, as long as they can't see it.
I think as far as that, I think you and especially with foliage, you start when you start your exhibit, you start with balance and symmetry in mind, and you should end with that in mind. And if you start, once you determine you're taking a set of leaves off, remember, in 10 minutes, they don't grow back. So you really got to be on the ball when you do that.
Tough to put back on, aren't they?
Yeah.
They're very tough, especially when you knock them over at a show.
Yeah, I've had that happen.
I tried to put it back together. It didn't work.
You know, a lot of times that stalk isn't straight. And then two sets of leaf accentuates the hook in the stalk, and that just kills the exhibit. All of a sudden, that you're looking at a crooked exhibit, you've got to take the second leaf off and just show it with one, unless you want a crooked exhibit, which I think, you know, even a not too particular judge is going to go right to that, you know, and it's going to prejudice them, you know, immediately, you know.
You know, the opposite, excuse me, Tony and I was on the phone for quite some time. We don't have any trouble BSing, but it came up about balance, you know, and he texted me a picture of Dick Parshall, and Danielle was still living then. A beautiful, 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 looked to me like an Abe bloom. It had two little tiny, I don't know, maybe about the size of a dandelion leaf, down at the bottom. And there again, you're throwing the symmetry and the balance clear out of the window, and you got a winning bloom. So show them.
So
I mean, I guess if you end on like say that, then you're judging against what's there, right? And that brings us back to the show judging. So we judge what's there and not necessarily we use the book and the rules as guides to make choices among what's there, right? But then we judge it. Does that make that right?
Yeah, I think, Misty, to that point, and I think that's really well taken. The exhibitors, a lot of at the big shows, the blooms themselves are so good because everybody's growing the best genetic varieties that we have. And if you take the time to nurture them, everybody gets a really good bloom head, usually. And sometimes the only thing that distinguishes some of your top growers is what's below that bloom. And a lot of times, like Randy said, it is the balance in the proportion of the stem, the stalk, and how those leaves look. And that's really best determined when what I like to do all the time is to take a judging table with a neutral background, especially when you're judging for the higher rewards and everything is really good, and step back 6 to 10 feet, like Wayne Shantz said, and rate the entries on balance and proportion. Which of these entries, of these, say you got 6 in front of you, which of them has an advantage just on the balance and the proportion? Now, that doesn't always mean you're going to pick one of those, because sometimes you'll get up close to it, or you'll turn it around and geez, half the petals have been plucked, or, it's bugs are all over the back end. So, I mean, you can't just, but I mean, you should start from a distance and saying, which of these entries really has an advantage by the way it presents itself? Which ones, how is the balance and the proportion on these? And then as you walk, and those are the most serious faults. If you see something back like that, and as you walk closer, you start seeing more and more because you're starting to put that thing under a microscope. But you have to remember the faults that you saw furthest away are the most significant. And when you're further away, not but only balance and proportion, I'm talking about looking at bloom symmetry and contour. If the thing is kind of lopsided from 6 to 10 feet, that's not good. I mean, that's a severe fault. It's a lopsided bloom. Or if you can see the centers oblong from a distance, that's a severe. So my point is that you have to really take into consideration how close you have to be to see the fault. Balance and proportion is often, best evaluated from a distance, and it should be penalized rather harshly if it's really out of balance. And there's no points on the scorecard for that.
That's the kind of consideration, though, Tony, that leaves you with a good idea of the importance of these 5 or 6 topics that we talked about today, because they are the kind of things that will influence that that balance and that proportion as much as the form and color. So it is this set of 5 or 6 characteristics, although they are relatively lower in value, they do significantly affect that balance and the proportion that Tony was just kind of summarizing well there. So they are important.
I have an off kind of question. How come England doesn't have leaves? So their judging's different then. Am I right? They don't have leaves when they show, right?
tradition.
Okay.
I think they're missing an important part, but I mean, that's the way they've
Yeah, the
always done it.
judge's lollipops, I mean, it's just it's a whole different game, I think a lot of you have heard me talk about how Australia does it, where you can exhibit it with or without foliage. And if they have foliage, most people bring the foliage separately and stuff it in like a florist would put ferns for effect, That just really killed me. I just said, why don't you guys challenge each other to put the foliage with the bloom? If you really want to really make this a competition.
You were a thorn in their side there, Tony.
Yeah. It was amazing. It was amazing when I judged their trial gardens, how my scores were just within, well within the margin of error. There were no outliers, and we judged probably, I don't know, maybe 20 cultivars in their big trial garden. But, the scores weren't final until they dug the dahlias and evaluated the tubers. And the tubers were the final score. I mean, how many tubers, the quality of the tubers, the size of the tubers.
I didn't know that.
Wow.
Yeah, that was unbelievable. I really think that was probably a good criteria to know. Doesn't even have tubers,
Right.
Wow.
Well, have we exhausted the discussion? We're happy to stay on if people would like to discuss more
I have
things.
a question about show schedules.
Yeah.
Do shows repeat from year to year, like the show, say at Summit Mall, would have the same criteria to enter, and then when are new show schedules published, and do some of you experienced people keep old show schedules to kind of prepare for the year coming up?
Yes, to the last, sure. But I think you'll find it to be unusual for a given location to change its schedule. Things, we tend to be, I guess, creatures of habit and repeat the schedules. The one that I'm most familiar with is the Geauga schedule, and we do keep changing that, but it's all tinkering. It's not big changes.
Yeah, and I've done the Summit Mall, our main show, for probably, I don't know, 10 or 15 years. Dave and I usually got together to see, okay, was there something last year that we should change? And it was usually a relatively minor point. So it certainly changed when we had to do the national show, because things are, there are a few things in there that are different. But from our own show year to year, it's pretty much the same. So if you want to review it, Chris, be my guest. I could at least give you a copy. You could read through it, because I usually do it, and then I make copies of it, and I think Sharon puts it on the web, and then I have printed copies for the show itself too. I'll be doing that probably in a couple months, maybe.
Because I would think the show schedule does it guide some of you guys for what you're picking from your garden to bring in?
Well, not necessarily, unless we have a flower of the year, which we really haven't had for a while. But I guess we have had, and it hasn't been all that successful. At least it hasn't been recently. So other than that, they're all basically
That's what I was going to say.
judged every year. So
It can
what you like
a little bit, because sometimes I know Mahoning Valley has some of the most creative categories I've ever seen, where they'll have three, same size, 3 different forms, yellow, 3 different forms. So some real creative stuff. And sometimes if you have a bloom that you have say you've got 3 Bs and you've got 2 that are a lot better and one's not that good, but you know, you could put it in a triple with other stuff, even though you don't have 3 like. So I think occasionally, yeah, you read that show schedule, sometimes you'll take blooms that you normally wouldn't take because you can find a category for them, you know?
Yeah,
Always
That's
reaching for-
newbie. I
the
did
same.
not know, like Summit Mall had a category for Tony and Ron, and so you may want to look at that and know what you want to plant too.
That's what I was. That's what
Yeah.
I was getting to. It's like I noticed at the Summit show, like you just said, Tammy, the things that there were there. I was like, well, I might want to try and plant some minors, and I might
Right.
want to try and plant some evangelistas.
So you would need to know ahead of time if you want to enter those, what tubers you may want to try to obtain to show.
Yeah, because like Randy said, leaves don't grow back in 10 minutes. I can't even grow Ron or Tony's in a whole year. So
That's our
I
fault.
wasn't aware of that. So that was new to me last year. Those extra categories, I guess you could call them.
Well, it's a special award. And of course, that's a function of how soon those who have introduced a variety, first of all, want to give extra money for winners, and 2, when they get that information to me, which is a function of when I ask for it too. Maybe I'm asking for it right now, Ryan. The rest of you.
And just for the new people who haven't been to a show, there are cash prizes associated with this usually. So like Jerry or Tony will like sponsor that category. So people like Todd, who I think is on this call still, or maybe he hopped off, you know, if you strategically plant things that you know have cash prizes, you can kind of walk away with a healthy sum of money to take your buddies out drinking.
Well, the best example of that just was at the national show. When was that, Ron? Was that last year, the year before, when that Bokeh Award was worth $2,300?
Well, it's still
The best Bokeh introduction was worth $2 or $3 grand.
I think they changed it after our show, didn't they, Jerry? That was our show. Yeah, that we were
It
in.
was an enormous amount.
Last year, I thought I saw was 26.
$2,600.
They kind
That
of
might influence what you grow.
all right, who's got one of those? I'll try.
That's why I grow it.
Ron, you talked about substance and how, like, by Sunday, a lot of the blooms are showing their loss of substance. I guess
Yeah.
here's a question for all of you experienced showers. When are you guys picking your blooms for the show? Like, if it's a Saturday morning show that you can get to, or if it's a Saturday morning show, you know, for some people, Summit Mall might not be something that you can get to in the morning. So you'd be, I guess that's my question. When would you pick them if you could be there that morning? When would you pick them if you have to set them up the night before?
I would pick the early morning of the day before the show. So like Petiti, I pick Friday morning. I guess I would do the same thing for Summit.
And there may be some blooms where you're going to pick on Thursday morning, some blooms on Friday morning, some blooms on Saturday morning. Following your maturity and the quality of your blooms.
And how well the
Oh,
variety
hold on a
keeps
minute.
too.
Yeah. How early can you pick, do you think, Randy, and still have a decent bloom by Saturday?
We've picked, actually, when we went down to Asheville to National, we picked all our blooms on Thursday morning. So they made a 10-hour ride, and
yeah,
but
you got beat by.
yeah, most, and obviously, I think I think you gotta think about it, and for the length of your drive, for the time when you pick, sometimes you want to pick a little bit of an immature bloom, and in a day and a half, it may be right there. So you always got to observe your blooms.
I have also had a bucket that I added some sugar to for an immature bloom. Always put a little bleach or a little bloom. Forget the name of the product.
Floralife.
Floralife, exactly. Yes, thank you, Randy.
I don't use
buckets if I have it. Couldn't happen, huh? But I'm thinking your immature blooms will grow, and I think a little sugar in the water helps do that.
Right. I have two things to say before we go, because I want everybody to know that Jim and Harriet were sitting in on this Zoom with us, and with that, I got to thank Sharon for
Zooming us.
Yeah, getting us all worked out so we're able to talk, which we weren't 2 weeks ago. So I want to thank her for that. It may be her curse. I don't know.
Oh, we're glad to have you for sure.
For sure.
And Jim and Harriet as well.
Something about I believe it was Chris brought up about show schedule, and I think well, you just can't shut me up, can you? Something that Kathy and I had talked about is something that I think is a little lacking, not so much here, but you travel to go to some of these shows, and when you get into the arrangements, they don't really publicize their themes as well as they should. So, and that takes time. People need to know well in advance so they can prepare for those themes.
And Randy,
we are working on our themes. They'll be out soon.
and also for those who are new, the themes they're referring to like the artistic designs. So it's not like a single bloom staged. Usually it's like an arrangement. Sharon, maybe you could give a little more context for people who don't know.
I'm chewing my corned beef.
Oh.
I'm getting a start on tomorrow. For the arrangements, we usually have an overall theme, and then we have sub themes so that people can make arrangements, and not to be real literal, but just to like bring out the feeling of the theme. So I'll give you an example of last year's. We did Wonders of the World. So we had the Grand Canyon. Well, we said use some rocks and kind of give you the feel of the Grand Canyon. Niagara Falls, make some water in it. The Taj Mahal and the Hanging Gardens of Babylon was supposed to be a cascading design. So things like that. And like I said, Anna and I are getting pretty close on what we're going to do for this year.
And we're always looking for people to submit more entries for artistic design. So take a stab at it this year. Tammy was nervous 2 years ago, and then she gave
still.
You've done great. You've won.
We need a class on it though.
We're working.
Now, is that specifically for the Cuyahoga Fair when you do the artistic, or is it at other fairs as well, at other shows as well?
So
that will be Summit and Petites usually.
Yeah, the DSO,
Okay.
the DSO
Thank
doesn't
you.
do it for the fairs, but the fair itself does have kind of like the artistic arrangements. It's just not part of the DSO show.
Okay.
And
Thank
then
you.
the Midwest show and the National usually have artistic also.
Right.
Okay, anything else anybody has? We're at 9 o'clock. And you're all so lucky that we will see you again tomorrow, same time, Zoom. And we should have a really nice presentation. And then we'll kind of run through some club business. And then lastly, I think we had a birthday guy this week. Ron, wasn't it your birthday? Happy belated birthday to Ron.
Thank you.
Happy
I'm
birthday,
trying-
Ron.
Happy birthday.
Happy
Thank
birthday,
you.
Ron.
I'm trying to forget him these days. Celebrate.
You
Thank
got-
you.
You got that right.
Okay.
So Ron, what's the temperature down there?
Actually, it was a relatively cool day. I don't think it got